Ya. Kemarin sudah disepakati apa kira-kira ya dari Pak Agung ya kemarin ya? HP silent. HP silent. HP cukup di silent aja Pak?
Ya silent aja, silent.
Di silent. Terus apa lagi?
Jam masuk.
Hah?
Jam masuk.
Jam masuk.
Pakaian.
Nomor 2. Jam masuk gimana Pak? Ya jamnya jam
8 kemarin kesepakatan.
Ya maksudnya ini akan terus berlangsung selama ini tepat waktu. Kalau tidak tepat gimana Pak? Dihukum. Waduh, hukumnya nanti belakangan. Nomor 3 apa lagi?
Pakaian.
Pakaiannya apa Pak? Bebas rapi pakaian. Pakaian bebas rapi.
Pakai baju.
Itu kan rapi juga ya?
Pakai baju aja. Disesuaikan.
Oh, bebas. Iya. Bebas rapi sesuai. Oke. Rapi. Terus apa lagi Bapak Ibu? Tidak boleh merokok di ruangan. Kayaknya udah ada peraturannya deh Pak. Iya. Yang lain. Kayaknya aturan hotel itu Pak. Ada lagi? Terima telepon di luar. Oke. Terima telepon di luar.
Gue dari tadi cari itu nggak bisa.
Ya. Ada lagi?
Dititip saja Pak.
Kalau jangan Pak, kalau yang itu sudah pasti Pak. Ya, ada lagi Bapak Ibu? Ya, sudah?
Kalau gimana nih?
Kalau ada yang melanggar ini bagaimana ya Pak Bu?
Beserta sama ininya buku keseluruhan.
Kenapa? Oh, dihukum satu kelas.
Ya maksudnya peserta aja atau narasumbernya juga terlambat. Ahli hukum juga.
Oh gitu. Wah, ini.
Biar adil ya. Iya biar adil.
Biar adil.
Karena peserta aja. Kita pelajaran dewasa kan.
Masalahnya narasumbernya masih di mana gitu Pak? Gak ikutan bikin ini. Narasumbernya ikut cuma Pak Nyoman. Tapi habis ini beliau mau pergi lagi. Ya, bagaimana? Sepakat dulu. Oh, suruh goyang sesar aja Pak. Oke. Baik, goyang sesar aja.
Ada yang kesulitan.
Goyang sesar sampai esok. Aduh. Makanya mau telat nih sengaja nih besok nih. Ya, itu saja kita sementara diminta goyang sesar aja ya.
Musik.
Musik, oh belum.
Jangan bukan.
Ini kan sifatnya
ada
enggak?
manfaatnya.
Ya.
Dia suruh apa yang dia tahu materi yang sudah selesai. Jadi pemaparan secara lisan aja. Daripada goyang dia nggak ada asas manfaatnya juga. Enggak. Biar ada
Ya.
yang ini.
Bagaimana? Yang setuju goyang sesar mungkin bisa angkat tangan. Ya, yang ringan. Ya. Yang ringan angkat tangan ya. Berarti semuanya sangat setuju. Ya, tadi kan yang setuju aja kan? Nah, sisanya berarti sangat setuju, ya? Oke, baik, gitu aja. Ya sudah kalau gitu. Gitu ya. Ya, baik. Karena waktunya sudah pas, mungkin Pak Gede bisa memperkenalkan pembicara kita berikutnya.
Ya, karena ini international training. Consortium Disaster Risk Reduction. Nah, selanjutnya itu dari Dr. Graham Talis. Beliau sebagai medical officer Disease Surveillance and Epidemiology di WHO Indonesia. Beliau akan membawakan Pandemic Preparedness and Response. Jadi buat yang kesulitan untuk mengikuti presentasi beliau, mungkin nanti akan saya bantu memandu.
Selamat pagi, selamat siang, actually. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Maaf, presentasi saya dalam bahasa Australia. Susah dimengerti, tapi latihan bahasa Inggris buat Anda sekalian. So I'm going to give a presentation on pandemic preparedness and response Actually, my main job in WHO is involved in avian flu and pandemic preparedness for Indonesia. So this is a topic I've talked about a lot in the past. Next. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to just briefly cover the epidemiology of influenza and then discuss the WHO pandemic framework, and an important thing for you to know about is the international health regulations. And I'll also talk about some of the current pandemic threats, and then the main part of the presentation will be on responding to a pandemic and highlighting a little bit this communication. So just, I don't know how many of you doctors, but you probably know all this. Just a recap of flu. It's characterised by rapid onset of symptoms such as fever, chills, sore throat, non-productive cough. But it's important is that it often, particularly in high-risk people, causes pneumonia, and in people with lung and heart disease can kill them. And high-risk groups include people over 65 years and persons with chronic diseases. From the experience of the 2009 pandemic, we learned that pregnant women are particularly at risk of complications. And pregnant women are now a focus for vaccination programs. So there's actually three types of influenza viruses, A, B and C. C is very rare in humans, but the two main types that we face each season is type A and type B. The important difference is this point. The type A infects other species, such as birds, very importantly, whereas type B is only seen in humans. And because of this link to birds, type A is really the one that causes pandemics, and I'll explain about that later. Type B just causes milder seasonal epidemics. So it's really type A that we're focused on in this presentation. So this is a picture of the influenza virus, and you hear, I'm sure you're all familiar with the term H5N1, H5N1, and that comes from this phenomenon. There's proteins on the surface of the molecule, the virus, that are called the H molecule or hemagglutinin, and that helps the virus to attach to lung cells and enter the lung cell. And then there's the N molecule, where N1 comes from, which is neuraminidase, and this helps the virus to release from the human cell. And then there's eight viral genes within the virus itself. But the important one is the H and the N, and that's what gives the name H5N1, H7N9. It's based on the typing of these molecules. So that's a little bit about the theory. And so this is an important slide because it illustrates that you can see all H types infect birds and all N types. So really influenza is primarily found in birds, particularly aquatic birds and poultry. Humans are only infected by certain types, and then other species such as pigs and anjing lao and kuda, they can be infected by various types. And it's this that makes avian influenza such a threat, because there's all these different viruses in birds, which occasionally, as we've seen with H5N1, infect humans. And that's how it's thought a pandemic can occur. And the mechanism is, you've got the various viruses circulating in birds, and it's thought that if a pig, for example, is infected by a bird virus at the same time as a human virus, because pigs have similarities to both, you can get this new virus emerging. And this process is called reassortment, and it's thought to be one of the main mechanisms for most of the pandemics that we've seen. This mixing might actually occur just in birds also, or directly in humans. But it's thought pigs probably are the main vessel, and certainly the 2009 pandemic was thought to be from pigs, from swine, barbie. But it could occur in other ways. Sorry, I keep getting this mixed up. So a pandemic appears in the human population rarely and unpredictably. And the important point is humans have no immunity. Can you see that? Am I blocking you a bit? It's hard for me to read the slide. And all age groups, including healthy young adults, may be at increased risk for serious complications. And it's a result of this antigenic shift or reassortment process. So that's the theory of how a pandemic will occur. So a new virus from a pig or a bird spreads in the human population. And these are the steps for an influenza virus to become a pandemic virus. There needs to be a new subtype that can infect humans. This new virus causes illness in humans, and the new virus spreads easily from person to person. So H5 certainly meets this condition and this condition, but H5 balloon beats are person to person, human to human. So that's why H5 has not yet, it's a threat, but has not yet caused a human pandemic. And this is the pandemics that have occurred in the last 113 years, since 1900. We had the 2009 pandemic recently, which caused 300,000 to 400,000 deaths. But the one that we often mention is the Spanish flu in 1918, and that was estimated to cause up to 50 million deaths. So this is the main fear, that H5N1 or H7N9 will be like the Spanish flu and cause millions and millions of deaths. This was with a population of the world of 2 billion. The population of the world now is 7 billion. So the thought is that with a severe pandemic, there will be many, many more deaths than the Spanish flu outbreak. In 2009-10, we were lucky. It was a mild pandemic. And the other two pandemics of the 20th century were also relatively mild. They still caused a lot of deaths, but not the numbers seen in the Spanish flu of 1918. This is the pandemic phases as described by WHO, and you can see here that the phases have been described to link to the emergency response framework. You're probably all quite aware of preparedness, response, recovery, leading back to preparedness as part of the emergency response framework. And the phases here in pandemic guidelines correspond. So we have the inter-pandemic phase, the alert phase, Atal Fasa Siaga, I think. Pandemic phase, when there's the pandemic's actually occurring, and then Fasa Transisi, when it's starting to decrease, but there's still, waves of deaths and complications. And these phases have now been linked to actions. I think I've already described that, but Day2.Pandemic phase is when you get prepared. The alert phase is, for example, with H5, we're in the alert phase. So where there's increased vigilance and careful risk assessment required, but there's no yet pandemic. The pandemic phase would be during the global spread of human influenza, for example, by H5N1. And these are the sort of actions that WHO would undertake. So these are WHO actions. For example, in the alert phase, which is now for H5N1, conduct global risk assessment, provide advice to member states, activate support networks, deploy antivirals, and intensify regulatory preparedness, particularly for the vaccine. So this is what we're doing now with respect to some of these new H7 and H5N1. And I just want to talk a little bit about the international health regulations, atau Peraturan Kesehatan Internasional. These are regulations established by a negotiation between the member states back in 2005. They were adopted at the World Health Assembly, which is the governing body of the World Health Organization. And Indonesia, of course, is a member of the World Health Assembly. So Indonesia, as well as the other 194 member states, agreed to these regulations, which came into force in June 2007. They gave 5 years to develop country core capacities, and the core capacities are things like capacity in surveillance, capacity in response, capacity in public health preparedness. And most countries, including Indonesia, asked for a 2-year extension. So the next deadline for reaching these core capacities is 2 years after this, at June 2014. The reason I'm mentioning this is because these regulations are important in terms of the international framework for disease control. And the central concept is a public health emergency, which is an extraordinary event which constitutes a public health risk to other states through the international spread of disease and potentially requiring a coordinated international response. So these public health emergencies are intended to be fairly infrequently declared. In fact, the only one declared so far is the 2009 pandemic. But there's many potential public health emergencies reported by member states. So the importance of this is if there was a outbreak of H5N1 in Indonesia, for example, we saw in North Sumatra in 2006 there was an outbreak of 8 cases. This would constitute a possible public health emergency and would need to be reported to WHO so that other member states can be warned of the risk. And similarly, other events would be reported to allow other member states to prepare for a possible pandemic. And this is the system of notification. So it's based on the capacity in the country, and this is why WHO is focusing here on helping the Ministry of Health strengthen its disease surveillance. So we can find a cluster of pneumonia, a cluster of H5N1, and that through the focal point, which is PADOR-PAL in Jakarta, would be reported to WHO. And at each step, consultation with other member states and other bodies like for example, a radiation incident, the Atomic Energy Agency. So this is, you don't need to know this in detail, but there is a system for reporting potential emergencies, particularly of infectious diseases, but also chemical and radiation public health events. this is the system by which WHO would be notified and be able to share the information with other member states so that they can be prepared or take action as necessary. And lastly, I just want to mention the emergency risk management principles of WHO. You're probably all familiar with this, but WHO principles of emergency risk management include comprehensive risk management, taking an all hazards approach, so the international health regulations deal primarily with infectious diseases, but chemical and radiation problems. A multi-sectoral approach, and not just a multi-sectoral approach, but a multidisciplinary approach. Another principle is to strengthen community resilience, so communities themselves can respond and the impact is mitigated. And it should be done under the principle of sustainable development and on an ethical basis, in other words, consideration of ethical principles such as respect for privacy, respect for human rights in an emergency, etc. So now I'm just going to talk about some current pandemic threats. This is avian influenza in humans, and as you can see, there's many different types of avian influenzas have infected humans, but the one that stands out, of course, is H5N1. Since 2003, in the last 10 years, there's been this many cases. So far more than the other ones. There was an outbreak of H7N7 in the Netherlands, but this was mostly mild illness, only one person died. And there's been other avian influenzas infecting humans, but the one we're really worried about is H5N1. Currently it's primarily avian to human transmission. There's no evidence of sustained person-to-person transmission. Although in some settings, such as North Sumatra in Tanah, there was probable person-to-person spread, but just limited. So it's infected maybe one or two contacts, but not ongoing spread to many people. And we've also learned that people can be infected by a contaminated environment. In H5N1, many of the cases are infected at live bird markets or through, contamination of the backyard in households. And this is the map of where cases have occurred. And unfortunately, Indonesia is still number one. 190, this is 192, but this year 2 cases have been added, so there's 194 cases. The next commonest country is Egypt, but you can see really that most of the countries affected are in our region, Southeast Asia, and this is because of the concentration of chickens and humans. Java and China and parts of Cambodia and Vietnam are very densely populated with both humans and chickens. So this is why our region is particularly prone to avian influenza. There's a new one that I didn't mention before, H7N9. This is another new virus that appeared in 2013, so just last year. It's highly lethal in humans. About of the 137 laboratory confirmed cases, 45 have died. So nearly or over a third of cases have died. And most of the cases have been clinically severe. So this is perhaps a bigger threat than H5N1 because it spreads easily in birds. H5N1 kills birds, so it's limited in how much it spreads by killing the birds. But H7N9 can pass through flocks of birds undetected, and there's no warning to the humans that they're being exposed to a lethal virus. but it's highly lethal in humans. So try to remember this H7N9 because this could be a real problem in the near future. I don't want to sound alarmist, but this is possibly a candidate for a pandemic. WHO is very concerned about this virus. And also because it's new. H5N1 we've known about for 10 years and still has not caused a pandemic. The behaviour of H7N9 is still unpredictable. So this is where it's occurred in China, and as you can see it's mostly eastern China. This is also very densely populated with people and chickens. So it's similar to H5 in that respect. This is the epidemic curve of H7N9 in China. So the outbreak was detected sometime in late March, April, but when they looked back, they found there were cases in February. They were able to confirm cases of pneumonia back here that were positive for H7N9. So the outbreak was really focused in April, and in April and May they started closing live bird markets and closing the Pasar Traditional and other measures like that seems to have controlled the outbreak. There's been relatively few cases since the markets were closed, but of course the markets are now reopened and it's also now winter, Musim Dingin in China. So we know influenza likes Musim Dingin. So we're watching very carefully what happens in China in the winter to see what's going to happen next. And lastly, you may have heard about this is not an influenza virus, but it's a similar virus. It's called a coronavirus, and it's been called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, which the reason this is of concern is this virus is similar, but not the same as the SARS virus that infected Hong Kong and Singapore in 2002. So this virus has spread from Saudi Arabia to Europe. There's been just a few cases in travellers to Europe. Most of the cases have occurred in Saudi Arabia. So this is another one we're watching carefully in case it becomes a pandemic also, but as I mentioned, it's not actually influenza. So now in the last half of the presentation, I just want to mention about responding to a pandemic, and perhaps more relevant to your role as emergency managers. So why are we worried about a pandemic? Mainly because it will cause a heavy burden on healthcare facilities. There'll be increased respiratory illness, and it's hard, especially in the first few days, to distinguish from other common illnesses. So mild respiratory illness is not a problem, although it will be a burden because there'll be so many sick people. But the next one is the real problem, increased severe pneumonias. During the 2009 pandemic, the use of intensive care beds, particularly in Australia where it took off, there was quite a lot of problems with lack of intensive care beds. Intensive care beds are very expensive to run, and there was a great burden on the healthcare system in the early weeks of the 2009 pandemic because of the need for intensive care. And the other thing it will cause is increased consumption of drugs, especially antibiotics, to treat the pneumonia that follows from influenza. In a severe pandemic, there's thought there'll be economic and social disruption with high absenteeism, so a lot of people not able to go to work. And this will affect critical government services. And in a very severe threat, there could be threats to rule of law and security if there is, that would be the worst case scenario. So in responding to a pandemic, there's really these strategic actions. We need to strengthen the healthcare system itself, the hospitals and Puskesmas. But there's also the need to undertake public health measures. There'll be need for special pharmaceutical interventions, particularly vaccination, but also use of Tamiflu. I'm sure you've all heard of Tamiflu. We'll need to strengthen surveillance. So these are all pretty much health measures, but then we also need to strengthen the whole of society approach, because as I've just mentioned, there'll be disruption to government services and other essential services because workforce will be sick. And then there'll be need to undertake special risk communication. So I'll just explain a little bit about each of those in more detail. So some of the things that will be needed in the healthcare sector will be SOPs to manage the influx of patients. So there'll be a need to separate those who can be managed at home from those who will need hospital admission. So there'll need to be new SOPs based on the characteristics of the new influenza. Similarly to clinical management, there'll need to be protocols for patient testing and laboratory confirmation. It won't be possible to test everyone to know whether they've got the new flu or not. Only some will be able to be tested. The thinking is that once you've confirmed that the virus is in a community, you probably don't need to test people. You really just confirm that it's come to Sumatra, for example, and then you assume that most of the new cases of influenza are due to the new virus and treat them accordingly. So, but this also, we need to strengthen the laboratory system so they can diagnose the new flu. New primers that will be needed for PCR testing, etc. So the reagents will need to be made available to the laboratories in the areas affected. There'll be a need to implement more stringent infection control, particularly in the early phases of a pandemic. You want to limit the spread to allow time for the vaccine to be produced. So particularly protection of healthcare workers is important. We need to protect healthcare workers from getting sick, and we need to protect other patients from getting sick. And there will obviously need to be more supplies such as masks, laboratory reagents, antivirals such as Tamiflu and antibiotics. And health facilities in particular in the preparedness phase, such as now, need to develop plans, stockpiles for consumables including PPE, deployment plans for the vaccine, etc. In the response phase, healthcare facilities, whether hospitals or Puskesmas, will need to isolate and manage cases, monitor antiviral effectiveness, give psychological support, including to staff who are threatened by the new virus, and maintain the essential services and possibly delay non-essential services. So the second strategic action is public health measures, and these will be not undertaken by so much hospitals, but by the Dinas Kesehatan Provinsi or Dinas Kesehatan Kabupaten Kota. So this includes consideration of cancellation of public gatherings such as a football match. So the idea is you slow the spread of the virus. Influenza spreads in crowds. So it's thought that in the beginning of a pandemic, you'll need to avoid crowded situations. So things like football matches, weddings, etc. may need to be postponed. And related to this is school closures. In the 2009 pandemic, Thailand, for example, and Australia, in the early stages, closed some schools to limit the spread amongst children. Thailand had entry screening. So public health workers went to the schools to measure the temperature of children entering school every day to stop sick children entering the school as a way of slowing the spread amongst children. Other things that will need to be done is isolation of cases. Not every case will need to be hospitalised. Not all cases will be severely sick. In fact, most will just be mildly to moderately sick. But to slow the spread, we'll need to isolate cases at home. So they'll need to stay within their home and minimise their contact with their family members. And we saw this done to a strong degree in SARS in Hong Kong and Singapore. It was really the only way they stopped SARS in Singapore was isolation of cases at home and quarantine of their contacts. But this obviously, you know, all takes a lot of human resources to implement all this. So this is why it's important that people like you are aware of what might happen in a pandemic. The third area is pharmaceutical interventions, and there's basically two. There's antiviral medicines, particularly Tamiflu, which you all know from H5N1, which limits the spread in populations in shortness illness in individuals. But the problem is there's not enough for everybody. So this is where we need to be prepared with protocols. Who gets the antivirals? You know, is it just the very sick, or is it the people who need to make decisions, the decision makers? So these are the sort of things that we need to be prepared for. Who gets Tamiflu? The second intervention, which is more permanent, of course, is vaccine. Vaccine gives your body immunity to the new virus. But the problem with the vaccine is it takes 4 to 6 months to be produced. The new virus has to be selected, which one will make the best vaccine. It needs to be then developed and then produced in large numbers and distributed. So in the 2009 pandemic, this took about 4 months for the first vaccine to become available. Actually, I think it was a bit shorter than that. There was some vaccine available after 3 months. But it took a long time to distribute it, particularly to where it was needed. So this was a real headache. And following the 2009 pandemic, the Ministry of Health has a distribution plan for a vaccine. But it's never going to be quick. So for most people, the vaccine won't be available when the pandemic hits. But it is, once it is available, it prevents infection in the majority of people. And then the fourth strategy is surveillance. It's important for measuring the progress of the pandemic, but also working out who the high-risk groups are. In some pandemics, if you recall in my earlier slide, most at risk were young adults and children, whereas with some other pandemics it was mostly older people, and that depends on what circulated previously, etc. So it's hard to predict who is the high-risk group to a new virus until you've got the surveillance data that tells you who is mostly being affected. And in 2009, the high-risk group was pregnant women. But the next pandemic, it might be different. It might be children, or it might be old people. So we need good surveillance to tell us where we need to focus our efforts. And we also need to measure the impact of the pandemic. The fourth surveillance strategy is developing making sure we have diagnosis capacity in place to monitor the viral changes. Because as soon as it becomes transmissible in humans, it will start to change. It won't stay the same, it will change quickly. Influenza viruses are always...
Ada yang kurang paham atau bagaimana? Ada yang ingin diterjemahkan?
Maybe just the response to pandemic we can translate.
Apa diulang lagi deh, satu ya?
Dari mulai tidak usah.
Tidak usah. Oke. Kita mulai yang response of pandemic.
Yeah, I think maybe because that's really the important bit. The rest was background. Ada catatan dalam bahasa Indonesia, tapi saya tidak berani pakai catatan itu karena bahasa Indonesia saya masih jelek.
Ada pakai dia bisa.
Aku bahasa Inggris dulu.
Yes, I will translate. Check. Test.
Yang sudah diumumkan kan, ceritakan aja yang
Oh iya.
yang ini aja. Dia udah capek ulang lagi.
Well, I've already said that.
Oh ini udah ya tadi ya?
Iya.
Oh, jadi di slide ini mencatatkan apa yang terjadi pada saat pandemi. Ada tiga sih sebenarnya, ada beberapa slide. Jadi pertama yang burden on healthcare facilities itu banyaknya kematian yang akan diterima oleh fasilitas, terutama fasilitas kesehatan ya, pneumonia, dan kemudian ada obat-obatan yang dibutuhkan, terutama antibiotik. Ya. Kemudian juga ada social disruption dan dampak sosial dan dampak ekonomi. Salah satunya banyaknya yang tidak masuk kerja seperti itu. Kemudian pelayan-pelayan pemerintah banyak yang terganggu oleh ini. Jadinya ada ancaman terhadap keamanan. Nah, kemudian ini, itu udah tahu Pak. Jadi gimana? Diterjemahkan? Aksi-aksi strateginya adalah untuk memperkuat sektor kesehatan. Jadi ini kita bicarakan pandemi bukan sebagai dampak bencana, tapi pandemi sebagai bencana itu sendiri. Kemudian bagaimana kita mengukur kesehatan masyarakat, kemudian mengintervensi secara farmasi, melakukan surveillance, dan ada pendekatan pandemic preparedness, jadi kesiapsiagaan pandemi ke seluruh lapisan masyarakat. Dan juga ada risk communication, jadi bagaimana mengkomunikasikan risiko ini ke awam biar tidak terjadi kepanikan yang malah akan menyebabkan pandemi tadi sendiri. Nah ini kita bahas poin per poin. Health sector saat ini tadi telah Pak Ilham menjelaskan. Ini harus ada protokol baru, ini baru standar baru untuk mentriase pasien. Jadi bukan makanya tadi itu adalah pandemi sebagai bencana, bukan bencana kemudian menjadi pandemi. Triase yang selama ini kita kenal kan ada merah, kuning, hijau. Mungkin kita ada standar yang berbeda untuk menangani pandemi. Kemudian protokol untuk mengetes pasien dan untuk laboratory confirmation. Jadi tidak semua dites, kan ada screening dan sebagainya. Juga ada protokol-protokol untuk agar tidak pandemi ini tidak misalnya disebarkan oleh tenaga kesehatan itu sendiri, dan juga supply yang sebagai preparedness, kita harus menyiapkan stok. Nah, tadi hubungannya dengan stok, health facilities dan logistiknya. Jadi di dalam fasilitas kesehatan, bagaimana kita menyiapkan, kita ada developing plans. Jadi hospital disaster plan-nya bagaimana, kemudian jika terjadi pandemi bagaimana, berapa dokter yang harus masuk pada saat itu, perawat yang menanganinya, juga harus ada standar apa saja, PPE-nya yang dipakai apa aja, APD-nya, dan vaksin, apakah tersedia vaksin atau tidak. Kalau tidak ada vaksin, apakah menerima pasien atau tidak di fasilitas kesehatan itu. Responsnya juga bagaimana mengisolasi dan memanage kasusnya. Ini nggak sembarangan ya kalau ada infeksi. Nah, di kesehatan masyarakat juga ada yang tadi dijelaskan pada saat ada pandemi, mungkin semua kegiatan yang melibatkan pengerahan massa dibatalkan. Ya, mungkin seperti konflik juga, jika ada konflik seperti ada pilkada. Nah ini pemerintah seperti itu. Nah, kemudian ini yang susah, education about hygiene ini bagaimana mengedukasi masyarakat. Jadi sampai sekolah ditutup dan lain sebagainya. Sama sekali intervensi medis melalui obat-obatan. Jadi bagaimana kita memberikan terapi obat-obatan yang baik dan benar pada masyarakat, terutama yang efek sampai 4-6 bulan baru siap. Padahal penyebarannya mungkin cepat ya. Tadi sampai sini ya? Sampai sini ya Pak?
Sudah.
Ini sudah. Nah, surveillance juga harus diperkuat. Jadi bagaimana tenaga kesehatan atau stakeholder itu bisa mengambil keputusan. Jadi high risk group-nya itu di sebagai target utama surveillance dan sampai berdampak. Impact of pandemic. Jadi impact of pandemic itu di surveillance biar kita tahu bagaimana magnitude-nya. Setelah kita tahu magnitude-nya, kita akan memberikan intervensi, strategi intervensinya seperti apa. Itu nanti akan dijelaskan.
So these are the key questions. One of the issues that arose out of the 2009 pandemic was there hadn't been enough consideration of assessing the severity of the pandemic. You know, everyone was expecting a severe pandemic because of H5N1, but instead a mild pandemic occurred, and that caused a lot of debate about the preparations. People had prepared for a severe pandemic, and in fact a mild pandemic occurred. And the Minister for Health in Indonesia, in fact, was one of the main critics about the lack of explanation of the severity assessment.
Oh iya, jadi tadi untuk mengakses, menilai seberapa parahnya itu pandemi, mungkin kita itu sangat penting sekali. Jadi Kementerian Kesehatan atau stakeholder itu bisa menentukan strategi intervensi yang tepat.
So these are the key questions. I don't think we need to go through them all, but example is how rapidly a new case is accruing. Well, you translate these things. So Gemma can't say yeah. Okay. So what groups of people are affected, are becoming severely ill and die? What type of illness and complications are being seen? This is the key question: is the virus sensitive to antiviral agents like Tamiflu? So these are examples of the sorts of questions that need to be asked to assess the severity of the pandemic.
Itu aja. Oh ya. Jadi untuk mengukur keparahan pandemi itu ada beberapa pertanyaan yang wajib ditanyakan dan harus juga kita mendapatkan jawabannya. Jadi seperti tadi, type of illness itu jadi jenis kesakitannya seperti apa, terus komplikasinya seperti apa. Kemudian yang paling penting adalah apakah virusnya itu sensitif terhadap antiviral yang akan diberikan atau tidak. Itu yang paling penting, karena pada saat menentukan strategi intervensi dan pembelian obat yang akan diberikan, itu akan apakah mengurangi keparahan pandemi atau malah akan meningkatkan.
And then moving on to the next strategic action, we need to think about the non-health sectors. It's not necessary to go through each word of this slide, But basically, through absenteeism, the fact that workers across the workforce will be absent from work, either through illness, being put in quarantine, having to care for sick children or sick parents, and through fear, it's thought there'll be a higher degree of absenteeism, which will lead to decreased supply, decreased demand for services, and increased demand for other services. And these three factors will lead to a breakdown in services and economic and social disruption. So the point is that there needs to be BCP, which is business continuity planning. Outside the health sector, there needs to be preparations and response also.
Ya, ini potensi dampak yang jika terjadi pandemi ke sektor lain. Jadi seperti tadi sudah dijelaskan di slide sebelumnya, ada banyak yang nggak masuk karena sakit. Jadi itu akan entah sakit atau meninggal atau mengursananya keluarganya di rumah. Jadi karena itu di lintas sektor itu, mulai di awam akan terjadi penurunan supply, kemudian penurunan permintaan juga. Tapi di saat yang bersamaan juga ada kenaikan permintaan. Misalnya karena pandemi itu banyak yang nggak masuk di kepolisian atau kementerian lain, jadi otomatis pekerjaannya akan terganggu. Jadi mereka akan membutuhkan banyak backup, bantuan, misalnya bank, kemudian telkom, seperti itu kan. Nah, akhirnya yang terjadi adalah breakdown of service. Jadi ada beberapa pelayanan publik yang akhirnya mati gitu kan, tidak terlayani dengan baik. Nah, oleh karena itu sehubungan dengan pandemi ini, alangkah pentingnya untuk mempunyai BCP. BCP itu adalah Business Continuation Plan. Jadi misalnya di kantor telekomunikasi pada saat ada pandemi, misalnya banyak yang sakit karena apa, itu berapa yang harus masuk. Misalnya call center-nya harus masuk, call center ada 100. Nah, minimal yang harus masuk itu ada berapa. Kemudian rumah sakit juga seperti itu. Misalnya ada pandemi apa, nggak bisa dong pelayanan berarti. Jadi pelayanan harus ada. Berarti mungkin ada bangsa-bangsa lain yang memberikan kontribusi ke IGD seperti itu.
But probably a business continuity plan does not need to be specific to a pandemic. It needs to be an all hazards approach.
Ya, business continuation plan juga nggak harus spesifik ke pandemi, tapi juga untuk yang lainnya. Jadi misalnya bencana lain.
And this is just a schematic representation of the whole of society approach. And these are the important sectors that we need to focus on: food, energy, telecoms, transport, finance, law and order, defence, health of course, and water. And the emergency preparedness cycle of preparedness, response and recovery is involved in all these sectors.
Ya, jadi ini sektor-sektor yang kemungkinan berdampak dan harus diprioritaskan pada saat terjadi bencana kasus ini pandemi. Jadi yang harus ada dan harus ada backupnya itu misalnya ya semua sektor ini. Jadi ini sama dengan siklus bencana yang sudah sering kita lihat, ada recovery, preparedness, respon, dan ada komponennya government, pemerintah, kemudian civil society, masyarakat, dan ada keempat sektor di situ bisnis.
And so this is just a schematic of how it was envisaged. This would apply in Indonesia to command and coordination. I won't go into a lot of detail, but there was Komnas, Comité Nasional Flu Burung, which also looked after pandemic flu, led by the Menko Kesra, and then similarly at each level at the Komda Provincial and Komda District. So this is in the National Pandemic Preparedness Plan of the Command and Coordination Structure in Indonesia.
Ya, ini contoh yang sudah existing ada di Indonesia seperti ini. Jadi kalau ada outbreak, terutama flu burung, kita sudah punya Komnas flu burung. Mungkin nanti sektor kesehatan menjadi leadnya jika terjadi bencana pandemi bersama dengan Komnas tadi, dan juga sudah ada turunannya di tingkat 1 dan tingkat 2.
And these are the sorts of challenges that are seen in a pandemic. We've already talked about changes in demand for goods and services, but there could be other disruptions like closures of borders, as we're seeing in SARS, overwhelming of healthcare services, collapse of critical services, workforce absenteeism, which we've already discussed, and public fear and panic.
Ini challenge-nya ini, ancamannya kalau misalnya terjadi pandemi juga kan, seperti yang kita sudah diskusikan sebelumnya. Jadi ada permintaan untuk pelayanan kesehatan yang meningkat, kemudian ada pelayanan yang kolaps, ada banyak kerja yang tidak masuk, kemudian ada chaos, panik di masyarakat, kemudian ada perubahan permintaan dan kebutuhan di logistik, dan ada penutupan cegah tangkal ya di perbatasan pada saat mau bepergian itu dibatasi.
And if you're interested, there's a film made starring Matt Damon and Gwyneth Paltrow called Contagion, which illustrates all this occurring in a pandemic.
Iya, dan juga sudah dibikinkan filmnya berdasarkan yang diperankan oleh Matt Damon sama Gwyneth Paltrow, tapi tidak akan diputar di sini. Silahkan dibeli di toko DVD.
Maybe you should watch it here. Maybe tomorrow night. And lastly, I just want to talk about the 6th strategic area, risk communication, which does 3 things. When there's low concern, we sometimes need to increase concern and motivate people to appropriate action. If there's excessive fear, excessive alarm, we need to diminish concern and deter people from unnecessary and harmful actions. And thirdly, if there's justifiable concern, and this is the most important one, we need to harness and guide people to appropriate action.
Nah, ini yang poin terakhir dari 6 tadi itu. Jadi ada, gimana yang menerjemahkannya ya? Low concern ini jadi bagi yang kurang peduli, masyarakat yang tahu tapi kurang peduli. Jadi dengan risk communication ini bagaimana caranya meningkatkan awareness dan bagaimana memberikan mereka agar lebih peduli, motivate action. Nah, tapi ada juga yang reaksinya berlebihan, excessive alarm. Bagaimana dengan risk communication ini, bagaimana untuk menenangkan gitu, jadi agar tidak terjadi kepanikan dan mengarahkan untuk unnecessary and mengarahkan agar tidak terjadi unnecessary and harmful action, jadi tidak merugikan, melakukan kegiatan-kegiatan yang merugikan, jadi menyebarkan BBM yang nggak jelas seperti itu. Nah, justifiable concern, jadi kepeduliannya tuh sudah pas, jadi ada ini dan dia tidak melebih-lebihkan. Bagaimana kita mengaitkan ini untuk appropriate action itu, jadi ya bagaimana SOP-nya kalau menanggulangi pandemi. Jadi dia sudah tahu dan sudah peduli, dan bagaimana mengarahkan kepedulian ini untuk disebarkan yang lebih bermanfaat.
An example of low concern was in the early days of H5N1. People continued to eat sick and dead poultry and therefore contaminated themselves or their family. And through appropriate risk communication, we were able to educate the public not to cook and eat sick and dead chickens.
Ya, jadi seperti tadi tentang avian influenza, bukannya untuk mencegah mereka untuk dengan hewan ternak tadi, tapi bagaimana mengedukasi, bagaimana caranya untuk memasak dan bergaul dengan hewan ternak yang
and just another thing we need to remember as technical people, public health officials talk about bacteria, viruses, etc., and disease states. But the public see things like flu as due to too much hard work, stress, getting wet in the rain. That's in the West. People think they get the flu from getting wet in the rain. Evil eye and superstition are other things that the ordinary person thinks is causing their illness. So they don't see things the way that public health officials do. And this is where risk communication is needed to take account of the different viewpoint of the ordinary person.
Ya, jadi di sini bedanya tenaga teknis, pemeriksaan teknis dengan orang awam melihat sesuatu. Jadi jika misalnya epidemiologi ya, kalau di tenaga kesehatan tuh melihatnya epidemiologi secara klinik. Tapi kalau di masyarakat dia melihatnya epidemiologi secara kronik. Jadi flu itu mungkin karena stres, kerja keras, kemudian kena hujan deras, kemudian ya itu kalau kita flu itu disebabkan karena ada virus, kemudian bakteri dan sebagainya. Dan inilah fungsi risk communication tadi. Jadi untuk memberitahu awam bagaimana yang sebenarnya dan bagaimana mengarahkan preparedness-nya.
And these are the principles of risk communication according to WHO, needing to build trust so that the audience will believe and act on the health information. In an outbreak, announce early to not to delay announcing an outbreak or giving the information because it gives the impression of a cover-up. Need to be transparent, so this means if you don't know something, you admit you don't know or that it's not yet clear. Not trying to pretend that the situation's under control when it's not under control. The fourth principle is listening, particularly for doctors. Doctors are used to giving information, but not so used to listening to what the public is saying. And communication plan in an outbreak or emergency, it needs to be planned, not just ad hoc. You need to have a plan of what you're going to say in the next few days or the next few weeks.
Ya, jadi ini prinsip risk communication, bagaimana mengkomunikasikan risiko. Mungkin tidak cuma di pandemi, tapi juga bisa diterapkan di bencana. Jadi untuk mengkomunikasikan risiko itu juga pertama kita harusnya mendapatkan kepercayaan dari awam. Jadi atau mereka nggak akan percaya apa yang kita sampaikan. Kemudian jangan terburu-buru untuk memberitakan sesuatu. Jadi tsunami air sudah sampai di sini, padahal kita di Jogja misalnya pada waktu itu. Kemudian ada transparansi. Jadi kalau misalnya memang tidak tahu, bilang tidak tahu, jangan ditambah-tambahkan atau disembunyi-sembunyikan. Listening. Jadi kita berusaha mendengarkan apa kebutuhan dari yang terdampak bencana, dan kita harus planning, minimal merencanakan apa yang kita akan sampaikan ke entah itu media atau ke apa.
And in a public health emergency of international concern such as a pandemic, it's a bit different to normal communication in that it's not just national communication but international communication that becomes important. The non-health media become involved, not just the health media. Different to normal situations is the economic consequences of a pandemic, and also it won't be just the public health staff that are involved, but usually because of the economic consequences, senior political actors become involved.
Jadi pada saat kejadian pandemi atau mungkin ada beberapa yang bisa kita terapkan pada saat bencana. Jadi karakteristiknya adalah pada saat terjadi pandemi atau pada saat bencana itu ada perubahan antara nasional ke international interest. Jadi ada apakah saya boleh berpergian ke negara ini? Apakah ada saat coronavirus saya boleh menunaikan ibadah haji atau bagaimana? Nah, seperti itu kan ada international interest. Kemudian ada non-health media involvement. dia memblow up media memblow up pandemi seperti itu. Kemudian ada economic consequences, ada konsekuensi ekonominya pada saat kita tidak boleh berpergian. Kemudian kita apa yang harus dikomunikasikan seperti itu. Sama kalau di bencana mungkin juga seperti itu. Di Jogja terjadi gempa, apakah saya mau ke sana, itu apa yang diblokir jalannya di sana kan seperti itu. Dan ada involvement of senior political actors. Jadi nggak cuma orang tenaga kesehatan aja yang memberikan ini berkomentar di media, tapi juga ada politisi. Nah, yang kadang-kadang yang entah data dan informasinya dari mana. Nah, ini juga perlu dimiliki.
And an example of that again is the Karo outbreak, Tanakaro outbreak of flu Burung. You know, the president was involved. There were effects on the Jakarta Stock Exchange when the possibility of human-to-human was being discussed. And not just Indonesia was in control of the information, but lots of people outside Indonesia were commenting on what was happening in Indonesia. So that illustrates all these points.
Jadi pada saat terjadi outbreak avian influenza di tanah Karo, nah itu ada terjadi bahkan media-media luar juga ikut berkomentar. Kemudian presiden juga ikut, kemudian banyak politisi yang ikutan berkomentar, memperkeruh suasana seperti itu.
Dan saham Jakarta turun.
Stock exchange juga sahamnya juga turun, jadi mempengaruhi secara ekonomi.
Nanti beda lagi, berarti udah 3 kali gimana?
So these are the last 2 slides. Just for your information, during the pandemic, these were the sorts of messages that were developed. Flu-wise was for prevention, wash your hands often, clean surfaces, information sharing to reduce panic, stay apart, keep 1 metre apart from others, especially sick people, and etiquette for cough etiquette, covering your nose and mouth when coughing.
Ya, ini pesan-pesan keselamatan untuk flu, jadi mencuci tangan, kemudian menginformasikan agar tidak terjadi kepanikan, kemudian agak jauh sedikit, kalau misalnya lagi flu, jangan dekat-dekat dengan yang mungkin akan menularkan. Etiketnya juga kalau misalnya batuk, ditutupi, mobil juga ditutupi ya, jadi jangan terkelihatan dasar.
And the flu care messages. This is for sick people. Care for the patient at home. Assess and improve your knowledge to care for sick people at home. Rest your sick and stay at home. And evaluate for signs and seek medical care if those danger signs develop.
Ya, ini juga salah 4 pesan untuk yang flu sakit di rumah. Jadi pasien di rumah, kemudian tahu apa simptom-simptomnya, gejala-gejala flu, bagaimana merawatnya, tetap di rumah aja meskipun sudah ada SPPD, kemudian ya standby di rumah aja.
So that's just an example of the risk communication that was taken in the 2009 pandemic. And so this is my final conclusions. Pandemics will occur and threats currently exist, H5N1, H7N9 and MERS coronavirus. Preparedness for a pandemic is needed, and that's why we're giving this presentation today. Responding to a pandemic is multi-sectoral, not just the health sector, and communications is a vital component of a pandemic response.
Ya, jadi ini kesimpulannya, jadi pandemi itu ya semoga enggak ya, tapi akan terjadi. Ancaman itu nyata. Jadi karena burung-burung berkeliaran di sekitar kita. Kemudian makanya itu dibutuhkan preparedness untuk kenapa itu kita memberikan presentasi saat ini. Kemudian merespon pandemi itu tidak bisa hanya sektor kesehatan saja, tapi juga multi sektor, apalagi tadi pandemi sebagai bencana. Dan komunikasi adalah sangat vital untuk respon terhadap pandemi.
Terima kasih, matur nuwun.
Setelah tadi diterjemahkan kelihatan mana yang ngerti bahasa Inggris, mana yang enggak ya. Yang ngerti pasti bingung. Ini ngomongnya apa sini kok beda lagi terjemahannya. Jadi ya harap dimaklumi aja lah.
Ada pertanyaan? Pertanyaan?
Ya, mohon maaf saya gunakan bahasa Indonesia. Mas Gede tolong catat. Jadi kita untuk penanganan pandemi, misalnya ini pandemi yang diketahui oleh seluruh dunia, dan kita tahu bahwa pandemi ini misalnya masuk ke Indonesia melalui pintu mana, jalur mana. Nah, kalau di Indonesia memang sistem yang kita ada punya, apalagi dengan edaran menteri yang terbaru sudah bagus. Tetapi yang kami rasakan pada saat kemarin kami melakukan simulasi penanganan pandemi pada saat penjemputan jemaah, itu belum ada persepsi yang sama antara kesehatan dan pihak bandara. Kita melihat pada saat pilot itu prosedurnya beda. Jadi kita orang kesehatan itu untuk mau merapat sampai di pinggir badan pesawat itu banyak prosedur. Sedangkan virus ini, pasien ini kan kita harus berusaha untuk jangan sampai semua penumpang panik. Dan pasien itu bagaimana kita evakuasi sampai ke tenda isolasi. Nah, itu yang memang mohon ada satu protap yang sama, baik pihak bandara dan karantina ataupun pemerintah setempat, karena pada saat itu prosedurnya agak sedikit sulit karena dari pilot memberitahukan ke ATC ke bandara ke otoritas. Dari otoritas baru bisa menggerakkan semua unit emergency yang ada di sistem. Nah, sehingga itu yang kita bilang, kalau ini birokrasinya seperti ini, kapan petugasnya itu melakukan evakuasi di pesawat, kapan melakukan desinfektan di dalam pesawat sampai ke rumah sakit. Nah, itu yang mungkin melalui pertemuan ini bisa nanti kita sama-sama diskusi untuk bagaimana, karena kita tahu bahwa pengalaman yang terakhir corona, yang kita bilang bukan Indonesia tetapi tetap jebol juga kan, karena itu birokrasinya. Terima kasih.
Bingung ya.
Tidak sudah dicatat.
It was more comment than a question, I think.
Yeah. I think it's more comment about the if there's a pandemic, and then no same understanding between the airport and you have any comments?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, it's more for the government to respond, I think. But I think there needs to be a better preparation. I think there is still a gap between airport actions and what happens in provinces and districts. And as part of the international health regulation capacity development, WHO is supporting the Ministry of Health to develop better synergy between Provincial Health Office and KKP. I think it's an important point.
Ingin saya tanyakan, tadi ada organisasi, kalau misalnya terjadi pandemi, itu yang bertanggung jawab adalah presiden, kemudian ada gubernur. Sementara di bencana ada incident commander. Kapan pandemi itu disebut bencana? Apakah dia tetap mengikuti struktur organisasi yang tadi yang bertanggung jawab presiden, atau kalau misalnya sudah dinyatakan bencana, apakah itu nanti menjadi bagian dari IC, bagian dari incident commander? Kalau misalnya sudah dinyatakan, karena kalau organisasi misalnya bencana, terjadi bencana itu yang leadernya kan IC. ditunjuk oleh, misalnya kalau untuk provinsi oleh Sekda. Sementara untuk pandemi tadi gubernur. Jadi yang mana mau dipakai nantinya? Kalau misalnya pandemi kemudian yang menyatakan itu bencana apakah gubernur? Kemudian kalau kemudian sudah dinyatakan bencana, apakah yang nanti jadi komandannya itu IC atau tetap masih gubernur? Jadi mungkin ada batasan antara kapan pandemi itu menjadi bencana, kemudian apakah itu bencana daerah atau bencana nasional atau internasional, itu mungkin ada step-stepnya. Misalnya kalau misalnya pandeminya berapa korban seperti itu baru dinyatakan internasional, kemudian berapa kemudian jadi masih bencana sebatas lokal, atau apakah ada semacam SOP-nya untuk itu?
I think it's a good question. BNPB has responsibility for pandemic preparedness, but in fact they say they don't have the technical capacity. So the responsibility still lies with Preparedness, particularly with Director Day2.Pandemic. But perhaps Ibu Henry, can I ask you to comment on this question of the responsibility in a pandemic?
Pada saat pandemi dideklar sebagai bencana.
Begini, kebetulan saya orang unsur pengarah di Badan Nasional Penanggulangan Bencana. Walaupun di Undang-Undang 24 ada pandemi epidemi sebagai bencana non alam, sampai sekarang BNPB belum menggarap itu. Jadi kalau ada bencana, ada wabah, itu masih diserahkan kepada Kementerian Kesehatan di bawah International Health Regulation yang bicara soal PHEIC, Public Health Emergency of International Concern, yang declare itu sebagai epidemik di sini. Itu adalah Menteri Kesehatan untuk nasional. Kalau KRB, ya Bupati sudah boleh ya. Tapi kalau sudah internasional, Dirjen WHO, bosnya Pak Rahamtalis, di situ ada Emergency Committee, di mana Pak Chandra Yoga juga anggota. Jadi yang menentukan waktu H1N1 2009 adalah pandemi setelah melewati sekian benua, sekian negara, itu adalah Dr. Margaret Chan atas nasihat Komite Emergency Committee ya. Di situ ada juga roster of expert, sekelompok orang-orang. Saya pernah diundang untuk jadi anggotanya, sampai sekarang belum. Nanti kalau sudah declare itu pandemi, seharusnya sudah pandemi, sudah bencana non alam, harusnya BNPB bisa mengambil alih sebagai untuk komen, bla insiden komandernya di atas. Kemudian karena ini sangat lintas sektor. Nah, mengenai di airport itu kita punya otoritas sebetulnya. Kadang-kadang kita tidak tahu terus. Ada note time, notification to airman, itu bisa kita spot kembali kan? Bisa. Tapi tidak boleh kita menggunakan wewenang sewenang-wenang. Ya, kalau saya lihat kemarin saya pulang dari Korea juga tertib mereka itu ya, semua penumpang diberikan kartu alat itu. Nanti kalau gejala-gejala ini tolong laporkan kayak ini gitu ya. Apakah Anda datang dari daerah endemis, MERS, coronavirus dan sebagainya itu? Tidak ada pertanyaan-pertanyaan. Ada apa namanya? Nyambung tak?
Ya, nyambung. Mungkin ini Pak yang membedakan maksud pertanyaan itu tadi, kita harus tahu dulu yang mana musibah, yang mana bencana Pak. Nah, maksudnya tadi dimasukkan dalam bencana itu kategorinya apa? Mengganggu perekonomian di sekitar itu atau tidak?
Kalau pertanyaannya dengan wabah ya, ada kejadian luar biasa tentu mengganggu tingkat lokal. Jadi keputusannya ada pada pemerintah daerah setempat, otoritasnya. Ya. Itu jelas itu kalau dia KLB ya bencana lokal di situ. Ya. Tapi kalau sudah tingkat nasional kayak H5N1, waktu itu saya masih aktif, nah Menteri Kesehatan mengeluarkan SK keputusan Menteri 1371. Besoknya juga dikeluarkan 1372 September 2005. Jadi dia nasional skopnya H5N1 sampai sekarang itu belum dicabut. Tetapi kalau penyakit-penyakit lain, KLB misalnya campak, demam berdarah, masih skopnya di kabupaten, kabupatian, sehingga bisa menggunakan dana dana wabah, dana KLB, kalau di dalam bencana dana on call, gitu kan. Jadi tingkat provinsi yang sudah lintas kabupaten tentu provinsi, bahkan sudah didelegir kepada kepala dinasnya. Jadi sudah jangan terlambat, kepala dinas kesehatan boleh menentukan ini sebagai KLB, tentu setelah berkonsultasi dengan atasan beliau, setelah pertimbangan sinyal-sinyal epidemiologis plus sinyal-sinyal bakteriologis atau mikrobiologis atau virologis memenuhi syarat, declare. Cuman sering tidak ada keberanian untuk, karena akibatnya buntutnya macam-macam, dihantam kiri, hantam kanan. Tetapi kalau seorang pejabat yang punya akuntabilitas yang bagus, profesionalisme yang bagus, mau dihantam besok diturunin dari jabatan tuh nggak takut gitu, tapi declare, berani. Ya, kalau risikonya dihantam politisi kemudian dicopot, itu risiko. Jadi Anda sebagai generasi penerus tentu harus berani mengatakan hal yang benar-benar adanya. Terima kasih.
Oke, terima kasih Bapak narasumber. Ini saya sedikit sharing, Pak.
Bentar dulu, rujukannya kita punya Undang-Undang 484 ya, tentang wabah penyakit menular. Kemudian terjemahannya adalah PP 40 tahun 1961. Buat.
Jadi saya pernah dilatih oleh WHO untuk Indonesia, Pak. Dr. Marlingom. Nah, jadi di Mataram waktu itu, Pak. Jadi di Bengkulu waktu tahun 2008 itu ada suspek AI yang dirawat di Rumah Sakit Umum Bengkulu. Keluarganya salah satu pejabat di Bengkulu. Jadi saya ditugaskan oleh kepala seksi saya waktu itu untuk mengambil swab. Jadi karena Dr. Marlingom ini orang Sumatera, keras karena orang Batak dia pernah bicara sama saya, Pak Albert, apapun keadaannya, siapapun dia, tetap laksanakan SOP-nya AI. Jadi waktu saya pengambilan swab itu dirawat di ruangan ICU yang merawat dokter spesialis anestesi, karena dia ditunjuk langsung oleh salah satu pejabat di Provinsi Bengkulu, tanpa ada APD satupun. Jadi waktu itu saya masuk, langsung saya bicarakan secara bagus-bagus dan saya jelaskan secara bagus-bagus, tapi tidak sampai saya dibilang ini, kamu tahu siapa saya? Karena dia bicara seperti itu, akhirnya saya keras. Siapapun Anda, mau siapapun Anda, tetap SOP harus dilaksanakan. Jadi turun tim dari rumah sakit umum itu, direktur ini. Tapi karena ini ada unsur politik, termasuk kepala dinas kesehatan provinsi Bengkulu waktu itu, saya tidak. Tapi ini sebatas ini aja, cerita kita sebatas ini aja. Jadi saya sempat dibuang, seperti kata Pak Mahdi tadi. Saya sempat dikucilkan sampai akses saya dibuang sama sekali. Tapi saya punya keyakinan kalau seandainya nanti mereka tahu, saya akan diangkat lagi. Jadi saya telepon Dr. Marlingom. Untuk sharing sama itu. Akhirnya turun tim zoonosis pusat ke Rumah Sakit Umum Bengkulu, dan ya memang mereka salah, termasuk juga tidak menggunakan APD. Tahu-tahu positif AI, ada yang panas, ada yang setelah dia kontak dengan itu ada panas, kemudian ya suasana semakin tidak karam waktu itu, dan akhirnya mereka menyadari kalau seandainya kemarin itu penularan dari manusia ke manusia ada di Bengkulu, ya habislah orang Bengkulu. Nah, tapi setelah tahu dan ini akhirnya mereka datang dan permohonan maaf mereka melalui parcel, melalui ini, dan saya diangkat kembali. Terima kasih. Dan ini maksud saya menceritakan ini kenapa? Apabila ini kejadian ini ada di provinsi bapak-bapak dan ibu semua, nggak usah takut, nggak usah ini, lakukan apapun yang sesuai dengan prosedur. Yakinlah, kalau memang kita benar, pasti akan benar. Terima kasih.
Just one comment about that. I think it's important. You know, we've been dealing with H5 for many years now, and because it's not very transmissible person to person, there's a risk we'll let our guard down. I think it's very important that we maintain vigilance for a change in H5 or entry of a new virus like H7, and that we do make sure that at each district there's enough stock of RPA, enough stock of Tamiflu where it's needed, or access to Tamiflu and access to laboratory testing. I think in many parts of Indonesia this is quite good, but in unexpected areas like Bengkulu, I think we need to make improvements perhaps.
Tadi nggak usah diterjemahkan. Aku nggak dengar. Jadi begitu, masih ada pertanyaan lain?
Yang tadi
saya ada, karena waktunya
tadi.
juga sudah habis, kita berikan aplaus sekali lagi buat yang sudah jadi narasumber tambahan. Selanjutnya gimana Mbak Hani?
Iya. Berikutnya.
Break.
Ya, lunch ya, makan siang sampai jam 2. Ini mau tetap sampai jam 2 atau mau kita tetap jam 2 ya?
Berapa?